In this video, we will show you how to replace your parking brake shoes on this Ford Ranger. These will be located behind your rear brakes. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing you need to do, safely raise and support the rear of the vehicle so the wheels are off the ground. Once you've done that, the next thing we'll do is continue on to removing your center cover. You can use a pry bar for that. We'll pop this out of place, give it a quick inspection, and we can set that aside. Continue on with removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now, since we're replacing the emergency brake shoes, you do want to pay close attention to your brakes. If it looks like they're in poor condition, now's a perfect time to go ahead and replace those. Let's continue on with pushing back the caliper piston. That's located inside of this area here. That piston itself will push back into this area. Now, there's a couple different ways you can push back this piston. You could either fully remove the caliper and push it back with a caliper compression tool, or while it's in place, continue on with a small pry bar. We'll make our way right into this area and carefully start pressing this back. Once you have movement from that caliper, we'll continue on to our 2 10mm headed caliper slider bolts. We'll start with the bottom one here. When you're removing these pins, you will find that the lower pin comes all the way out. As for removing the upper one with the vibration dampener on it, typically you just loosen this enough that you can remove the caliper. After that, remove the slider pin bolt from it. There we are. Now we'll be continuing on with our pry bar again. This time we're going to pry the caliper and brake pads out and away from the bracket here. When pulling it away along the bottom, typically you will find that you have a small metal lock on the outboard pad. I'll show you that in 1 second here. Let's go ahead and start pulling this out of here. Looks like the outer pad's stuck in there. That's okay. There goes that brake pad. We'll give this a quick inspection, set it aside. Now, while we're holding onto the caliper itself, let's have a close look at where that caliper piston is. Double check to make sure you don't see any fluid here. If you do, it's more than likely brake fluid. If that's the case, you have to replace the caliper. This one looks good, so let's put it aside, putting no pressure on our flex hose. The brake pads are typically in the caliper itself. On ours in particular, they were pretty much still stuck in place. Now at this point, let's just give these a close inspection, make sure they're not damaged or worn at an odd angle. With that out of the way, let's remove the brake rotor. We'll give this a couple light bonks with the hammer here. We just want to cause some vibration to break it free. Start a lug nut on there just for safety here. Let's get this out of here. Let's just give this a quick inspection and set it aside. With the brake rotor out of the way, we have a clear view of our emergency brake shoes. We want to pay attention to the actuator, which is located along the side where the caliper would be located. It does have a pivoting point. If yours is frozen like this one right here, use some penetrant, let it do its job. Along the other side, we'll be looking for our adjuster. This has a small cog on it. Just let the penetrant do its job over here as well. Now in this same area, we're going to start by removing this spring. To start removing the spring, you could use some long nose pliers or whatever works best for you. You'll find that each side of the spring goes up into a small hole on each one of the shoes. Once you have one side removed, the other side should come right out. Commonly, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the mounting hardware for your emergency brake shoes when completing this process. With the spring out of the way, let's remove the adjuster. You can use a pry bar. I just like to use long nose pliers, make my way in between this area and gently separate it. We'll have to take this apart and clean it up. Go ahead and set that aside for now. At this point, you'll find that each one of the shoes is held in place with an anchor pin and a locking clip. On our application, we'll be starting down along the bottom. Press in on the locking clip. Once you've done so, you can take that pin and slide it out of the lock position to the larger hole on the clip. Let's get the pin out of here. Just push that through. Should be able to see it coming through the backing plate there. Once you remove the pin, inspect your backing plate. Make sure it's not rotted in any way. If it is, you need to go ahead and replace it. Now we should be able to take hold of this shoe. We'll give it a little twist, separating it from its last spring, holding it in place. There's one. Let's do the same to the next anchor point. Now as we start lifting this shoe up, we also have that upper spring. Go ahead and remove that. Remove your anchor pin, close inspection, and an inspection of your backing plate. And there it is, friends. Now it's time to look for the actuator. That's on the side that typically would have the caliper. On this actuator, it should be attached to your emergency brake cable, which would come along the back side of the backing plate here. Ours was so frozen that the cable actually came right off of the hooked area. Typically, you will have to separate the cable from this. Once you do so, go ahead and bring this over to a wire wheel, clean it up, and lubricate it. This one's extremely frozen, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of work. Now that we have everything out of there, let's continue on to cleaning and inspecting the mounting points here. We have the area where that adjuster was. If you were to look through there, there's a small port. Typically, you don't have to worry too much about that, but you do want to make your way all the way across the backing plate. You'll find that you have several raised areas where your parking brake shoes will sit against. Make sure it doesn't look like they're rotted and flaking like this does right here. If it does, use a little brush, give it a clean scrape, and double check to make sure it's not weak in any way. Once it's cleaned, let's add a little bit of high temperature lubricant to each one of the points that come up and hit up against those parking brake shoes. Let's continue on to our actuator here. As I mentioned, you do want to ensure that this pivot point can move. I took it to the wire wheel, cleaned it up as much as possible, and then I applied a thin amount of lubricant here. As you can tell, it moves freely. Now that we've done that, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to your adjuster. The adjuster itself has a threaded area with a small cog on it. That cog is the adjustment point. You would want to turn this one direction or the other to either expand or contract this to adjust the shoes. I've got myself a new hardware kit here, so it's nice and clean. I lubricated it well so I don't have to worry about any rust. Let's pay attention to that emergency brake cable and our actuator. Now I'm going to set this in here while it's off of the vehicle, just so you can see exactly what needs to happen. Once you put the cable through the back of the backing plate, along the outboard side here, we're going to take this actuator, slide the hook right through the cable there, and then at that point, it should fit into the actuator just like it is here. Once you have everything in place, continue on to installing your 2 emergency brake shoes. Let's get this in there. Now while we slide the cable through, you want to make sure that you have the plug in there as well. That's going to help prevent moisture from making its way into this area. There we are. Now let's continue on to installing our actuator. Let's carefully put this in place, sliding the hook through that emergency brake cable. Careful not to miss it. There we are. Let's start installing our emergency brake shoes. We'll take this spring. Now when you look at this, you can see it on each side. You have a small hooked area that goes into your parking brake shoe. You'll have the coil area, but then you also have the shafted area of the spring that leads all the way down to the far side. We want to make sure we have it in this orientation when we put it in the vehicle. I'll turn this over. If you were to have it in this orientation, with this shaft area facing close to the ABS ring, you could potentially cause some damage. Let's take this and start putting it in position, sliding it past that actuator. Just bring it right down there. When you set your shoe on here, you want to have it on the mounting point, but also sitting on the actuator in there. Continuing with this shoe, let's make sure that we have it mounted. We'll take our pin from the back side of the backing plate and slide it right on through. Align it with that shoe here. At this point, we want to put our locking clip on there, holding it in place. When you look at this locking clip, you'll find that one side has a circular hole. The other side has a slotted hole. For this hardware, we'll be making sure that the slot aligns with the pin. Once we have it so, we'll continue on by pressing in on the clip and twist the pin. Looking at this, we want to ensure that we do have that pin in the completely locked position. Let's set that shoe into the proper mounting point here. Just slide it right up onto the groove here. Now it's time for the lower shoe. We'll use some long nose pliers. Take hold of that spring and carefully put the spring along the back side of the shoe. Slide it through the mounting port and make sure it's secured. At this point, I can see my spring on the inside there, but it's not seated perfectly on the shoe. Let's have a quick look in here. I can tell that the spring is not perfectly secured, so we'll just use an angled pick or a small prying device and go ahead and press it right through there. Could even try to use your finger. Just be careful for any pinch points. There we are. I can see the entire ear making its way through the shoe here. We'll just confirm the same up along the top. Along the forward side here, let's continue on with our small spring. Take that and put it in position. Once you've done so, continue on with your adjuster. There's our adjuster. Now when you go to install this, you want to ensure that you have it in the same position as when you had removed it. Make sure you have it in the proper orientation. Gently spread those shoes. Time for our lower anchor pin and locking clip. Slide this through the backing plate. There it is. We've got our locking clip. Make sure you have it in the proper orientation here. Before we continue any further, double check each and every one of your mounting points and springs. We want to confirm that it's situated perfectly. That way there, nothing comes apart while we're driving down the road. Now it's time to clean the mounting point on our axle hub area here. You want to make sure it's a nice smooth surface so when you have your brake rotor on there, you won't have a brake pulsation. Let's continue on to removing each one of our two tins here. can use a small hammer, pry bar, whatever you have. Now let's go ahead and clean this up, give it a close inspection, and we'll set it aside. We will be reusing it. The next thing we'll do is clean up those mounting points where those tins were located. Now that we have these cleaned, the next thing that you want to pay attention to is each one of those tins. Clean the inboard side here, where that bracket was located. Typically, it will have a whole bunch of rust and debris. Aside from that, you do want to make sure the outside's nice and clean so your brake pads will be able to move around as needed. Let's lubricate these bracket areas. We'll use high temperature lubricant here. You only need a tiny amount. This will help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Install your tins. We'll take this and put it in position. Start it on there. There we are. Before we can install the rotor, the next thing you want to do is apply a thin amount of anti-seize on the mating surface. Now, as far as the brake rotor, you want to make sure that you clean the mating surface and the area where those brake shoes are going to ride. Let's clean up our brake rotor. And now we can get this installed on the vehicle. Just take this and slide it on. If it feels like you have a hard time installing your brake rotor, you may have to de-adjust your adjustment. With the rotor in place, it's time to pay attention to our caliper. Remove each one of your caliper slider pins and clean and inspect the mounting points. You want to inspect that boot, make sure it's soft and pliable, and inspect the pins. Make sure there's no rust or debris. Nice and soft. Just twist up a rag, slide it through that boot there. Try to remove as much of any of the grease that might be in there as possible. The main area of concern while you're inside this area is along where the caliper is itself. Let's give that a quick wipe. That one didn't have any lubricant in it. Double check that boot real quick. Do the same to the other slider pin. At this point, I've cleaned both of my slider pins, especially down near each one of the ends where the boot will sit. By cleaning those areas, that'll help prevent moisture and debris from making its way into this area. Continue on with some high temperature caliper lubricant. We're going to go inside of each one of these boots. The most important part while you're lubricating this is along each one of the edges and along the center area. Continue on with your slider pins. We'll take these and slide them into position, making sure that the boot is perfectly situated on each side of the pin itself. I can see the pin coming out right there. We'll just make sure this goes back and forth and the boot does not slide out of position. Do the exact same thing to your other slider pin. With those lubricated, let's continue on with that high temperature lubricant. We'll lubricate this side of the piston right here and the back side of each of these two ears. Now it's time to install our brake pads. When you look at your kit, you'll find that you have two outboard pads. That's the pad that has this hook on it. Match up the brake pad. Make sure you have this pinned area facing in the same direction as your original brake pad. For the inboard pad, you'll find that you have 3 locking tabs that will fit directly into the center of that piston. Press it in, listen for a click, give it a little tug to make sure it's secure. Time for the outboard pad. You'll find that you have your locking clip, and if you were to look at the pad itself, it does have 2 tabs that protrude out a little bit. Get this on there. Double check to make sure your pads are completely seated, and now we can install this onto the vehicle. When you put your caliper on here, we're going to have to roll it in position, starting with the upper portion here. Once you have the upper portion set in, roll the lower aspect in and lock it in with this tab here. Now we'll continue on with our 2 caliper slider bolts, starting with the upper one. This one's going to be a little bit difficult to get into position. Slide it right in there. This lower one in here. Now at this point, you can go ahead and bottom these out. Once you have those snug, you can torque them to 18 foot-pounds. As you can tell, torquing this one's a little bit difficult. If you had a crow's foot, you could torque it. Otherwise, just continue with your wrench and make sure it's nice and tight. The next thing we'll have to do is make the adjustment for our parking brake shoes. To do that, you'll be coming through this port along the forward side of your backing plate. Use a small pry bar. We're looking for the adjustment cog for that emergency brake shoe. Now, once it gets to the point that you adjust it and you cannot move this rotor at all, you need to continue on by de-adjusting this, just a couple clicks here. After you can move it, continue on by tugging on your emergency brake cable. The way you'll be able to tell if you're properly adjusted is if you tug on the cable just a little bit and it holds this, and when you release it, it releases completely with no drag. At this point, it's time to reinstall the wheel. Before you do, just do a quick overall inspection. Double check to make sure everything's tight and in place. Let's get the wheel on here. Start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts. Bottom them out, get the wheel safely back down on the ground, and we'll torque this to 100 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely back down on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. If you have a center cover, go ahead and install that now. Double check to make sure it's completely secure so it does not fall off on you while you're driving down the road. Okay friends, we've got our vehicle back together. The process for one side of the vehicle is the exact same thing as the other. Once you've completed that, make sure that you pump up your brake pedal till it's nice and firm. After that, go ahead and take the vehicle for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.